and welcome to Liberty Nation's LNTV. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Now, today we're joined by Legal Affairs Editor for LibertyNation.com, Mr. Scott DeCrescenzo. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
Now, Scott, with all this happening with the COVID-19 coronavirus, but also on a broader scale, we've noticed that there are certain things happening to the rights of Americans. Now, Scott, can the president suspend the rights of Americans?
Well, there are rights that we hold under federal law and rights that we hold under state law and rights that are guaranteed to us that the federal government recognize, also called constitutional rights. He cannot abridge or violate those constitutional rights because there is no provision in the Constitution itself for the suspension of those rights during an emergency. We are guaranteed that the government respect and honor those rights. Now, there may be a legal right to such and such under federal law, that type of right can be suspended or modified as a result of the state of emergency, but not our fundamental or constitutional rights, Mark.
It's funny you should mention that because I recently learned just before recording here that during Hurricane Katrina, the authorities actually confiscated guns. Now, surely that falls under the Second Amendment right. So how is that consistent with what you just said?
Well, it's not consistent, and those authorities who did in fact order the confiscation of firearms from, and it's important to add, to people who were lawfully holding firearms. These are people just in their own homes who were armed. They confiscated those guns. In fact, went into people's houses and basically stole them from them, and they did so in violation of the law, Mark. Now, unfortunately, I think because of sympathy for those officials, they were not prosecuted as criminals, which I think would be warranted for violating the civil rights of the people who they confiscated the guns from. But federal judges in multiple instances ruled that confiscation was not okay. They had to pay a settlement and ultimately return the guns. Cold comfort for sure for those who were in the midst of a crisis and perhaps needed those guns to defend themselves, but it was not upheld and stands as an example, I think, for what not to do for officials rather than the precedent for something that they would be continued to be allowed to do.
Okay, so with this particular national emergency that Donald Trump has declared, President Trump has declared, what's the situation? What's going to happen in terms of constitutional rights? Obviously, you've mentioned probably not a lot. Federal and state. What's going to happen with those?
Well, the state of emergency that Donald Trump declared has to do with federal laws that already exist that allow for different rules to be in place, often for the spending of money, but for perhaps other provisions, provided the president does make that declaration. And so that's why that declaration is important. If he's allocated certain funds to provide for X, but in the state of emergency, he can do perhaps many other things with those funds, then it becomes a legally important trigger. It's just not an important trigger when it comes to, for instance, our right to travel or our right to free speech, those sorts of things.
Okay, and of course, states have enacted certain measures as well, from the closure of businesses, which is obviously much easier if those places have liquor licenses, I guess. What do you make of this, Scott?
Mark, I saw one case reported over the weekend about a man from Kentucky who left the hospital against doctor's orders and declined to say he would self-quarantine, and Kentucky authorities placed armed men around his home. Now, I don't know if, how serious that could get. I mean, what if he decides to leave the home? Are they empowered to arrest or worse in terms of using force against him? This is fairly new, and the answer is where that line is drawn. I do not yet know, but I suspect by the end of this crisis, we'll have a more fleshed out understanding of where the courts see what powers they consider constitutionally appropriate for this kind of crisis. I will say to you, though, there are certain rules that may be suspended out of necessity, but then as soon as the necessity dies, and I mean as soon as the necessity dies, then that abrogation or derivation from the rules has to reverse back as well. You can imagine, for instance, we had a situation in the U.S. Last year, I think it was, where many people said they were going to storm Area 51, right? Well, let's say that did happen and there was 100,000 people that stormed Area 51. Well, that area is in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. So if you're entitled to see a judge within like 24 hours of getting arrested, for instance, well, if there's 100,000 arrestees in a town with one judge, you can imagine that's just not possible. Well, the courts won't say that the authorities then had to do something that was impossible. But they would say that they had to be seen then as soon as they could be. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about for this sort of ethic or judicial ethic of the emergency.
Well, Scott, thanks very much. I mean, it's concerning constitutionally. It's concerning in terms of the liberty for the individual. And I do hope we can talk about this again very soon. Thanks for being here.
Mark, it's important for everybody to remember that it's in these times of crisis when those who are most eager to steal liberty will try and perhaps be successful. So everybody should be on guard. Thank you.
And thanks to you at home.
Hi folks, Lisa K. Donner here, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. We hope you enjoyed watching this video, maybe even learned a thing or two. If so, please take a moment and subscribe to our YouTube channel right down there in the corner. Thanks so much.